You like when the soldier come and take picture to your kids?
Say cheese.
Imagine in the moment now of this sort of push to do anti-racist education and anti-racist work in the era of Black Lives Matter, and politicians being like a little wary of it. Like if there is a white organization that comes along and is like, oh, you can listen to us, we'll tell you how to do anti-racism.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Do you remember Afghanistan? For 20 years, the United States ran it. 4 months ago, the Taliban took over, and the Afghan people are facing starvation. Yesterday on MNBC, the announcer said that 20 million in Afghanistan need food assistance and 9 million are facing starvation. Could 9 million people die this winter? Consider what the U.S. accomplished in Afghanistan after 20 years. They spent trillions of dollars on war and on rebuilding, changing, transforming the Afghan economy so that a poor but surviving country now is a totally dependent basket case. It's facing unimaginable calamity. From Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. Incredible failure. Also, remember, though, that the United States has frozen the account on some $9 billion belonging to the Afghan Central Bank. And on the relatively minor issue of the U.S. wiping out an entire family on the last day its troops were in Afghanistan, we learn that no one will be punished. Neither the generals who made the policy, nor the lower ranks who carried out the killing. It was an error, tough luck, let's move on. Needless to say, we are repulsed about the Taliban. Amnesty International reports about a medical doctor, a female, who can't treat patients because the Taliban refused to let her leave her home. Could we suggest that the Taliban and Biden officials meet publicly and on live video discuss the problem and work out some kind of settlement? 9 million lives are at stake. We have many times talked about thousands of Syrians trapped in an area near the closed borders of Iraq and Jordan, a place called al-Rukban. The U.S. has a base 30 minutes away, and while it won't let Assad forces conquer the area, it won't help the desperately hungry and needy people of the area. This is the latest appeal from al-Rukban.
عن المعتصمين في مخيم الركبان بعد أن تخاذل جميع الأطراف من مجتمع دولي ومنظمات دولية والأمم المتحدة، نتوجه إلى التحالف الدولي الموجود بمنطقة التنف كسلطة أمر واقع. نطالبكم بما يلي: 1. العمل على دعم الاستقرار في منطقة الركبان أسوة بما تقدمونه بمناطق قسد. 2. تأمين الطبابة كحق أصيل من حقوق أبناء المخيم. 3. تأمين الغذاء لأهالي المخيم أسوة بالمناطق الأخرى في المناطق المحررة. 4. تأمين التعليم لأبناء المخيم. 5. تأمين فرص العمل للعاطلين عن العمل في مخيم الركبان. 6. العمل على تحسين الواقع الخدمي في المخيم. 7. سيصدر عن المعتصمين لجنة هي الممثل الشرعي والوحيد للمعتصمين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
This next clip is from the Israeli group B'Tselem. It shows Israeli soldiers coming into a Palestinian home in the evening and lining up the children to take pictures.
Let's go. ماشي بابا تعبوا. لا
لا وين نطلع؟ I work in بيت سالم. This is my work.
ماما
I work in بيت سالم and this is my work.
في حاجة أفضل من اللي صغار. محمد نسيت ولي فلوس شوية. كلهم يطلعوا يلا. محمد سيف كلهم دول صغار يطلعوا
صحكم من نومي روان عادي ما اشتغل تعالي ما تعرفون بعيطوش روان تعالوا
اتوضوا يا منال.
روان
اتوضوا.
هي عندك
בגלל שהם זורקים אבנים פה,
بشرى خلص بشرى
بشربش
خديهم واحد خلي يصورهم.
يا روسكي знаете اوكي
פרוסקי?
لا بروش
יאללה, יפה.
يا زاد بروش
יאללה, תעמדו רגע, את רוצה להגיד להם או שאת לא רוצה? You want to tell them?
What
You want only to take a picture?
Yeah, I want to take the as
Listen.
you want to take the picture and I want to take the picture.
Yeah.
They are kids. You like when the soldier come and take picture to your kids?
Say cheese.
ادم
Cheese.
لا نو نو
מה
ليش لا؟
أيوة.
لانه كان نايم سليب وانتوا جيتوا خوفتونا
cheese.
نو لملموها معنا اذا شوفوا انه احنا ما لعبنا لهم شيء بيضحكوا شيء عادي.
Say cheese. How revolting. And you have to agree with B'Tselem's closing remark. For Israelis, all Palestinians, including children, are potential terrorists and can be awoken at any hour for a lineup. And what's with this headgear that these Israeli soldiers are wearing? Are they chefs or smurfs? Is it really necessary to wear desert camouflage when invading the home of a Palestinian? I want to call attention to some headlines on our website. The first is the growing number of Israelis who call Israel an apartheid state. Most importantly, the publisher of Israel's paper of record, Haaretz. Second is the claim by the Jerusalem Post that Israel has set a deadline for an open military attack on Iran and shared the date with Biden. And allegedly he has no objection. And in our archive, The Fiction Front, 2 reviews of the new movie, a revival of West Side Story. Several Jewish federations and the ADL have been sponsoring a film showing of a movie that pretties up the reputation of an especially violent prime minister of Israel named Menachem Begin. On the 11th, the Middle East Crisis Committee sponsored a panel to try to counteract the propaganda. One of the speakers was Emmaia Gelman, who got her doctorate with a study of the ADL. She teaches political and cultural history of race and queerness and their intersectional connections with colonialism and capitalism. We play a portion of her talk today.
So I'm here to talk about the Anti-Defamation League, and also I'll just say a few words about the Jewish federations. The ADL is the reason that we're talking about these, and that it's important to talk about them, is that the Anti-Defamation League is often viewed as a progressive organization, as an anti-racist organization, and the Jewish federations are often they have less of a progressive image, but they're often viewed as just sort of a neutral community organization, and neither is true. The Jewish federations have a long history that's worth looking into. I mean, to a historian, everything that happens now has deep roots, and the Jewish federations, their roots are in the progressive era that produced a lot of the sort of model of charity that we've come to understand as damaging, where that form of charity is sort of as much about the status of donors, a social circle that's about the status of donors, and about donors controlling what kind of programming can happen in communities, and sort of making sure that it doesn't go outside the political lines, as it is about actually supporting community development. And the Jewish federations are no different from other foundations that come out of the Gilded Age, the industrial era, where the mega rich bowed to help the people whom they had impoverished a little bit. But the Jewish federations have most recently been protested for funding organizations like Canary Mission, the Middle East Forum, which is Daniel Pipes' organization, the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which is Stephen Emerson's organization, both important drivers of Islamophobia and war, and also the Tea Party Patriots, which were, there's some argument, but not much real disagreement over whether they were funders of the January 6th insurrection. So this is the federations, their hands are dirty, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm not going to talk about the federations. I'm here to talk about the Anti-Defamation League, but it's important to distinguish between the images of these organizations and the work that they actually do. So as Dan mentioned, I am a historian who studied the ADL, not because I'm particularly, enamored of the ADL, but because the Anti-Defamation League is an institution in US politics. I don't think of it as a Jewish institution, really. It's an institution that's been active in US politics and making law and policy, particularly around race and capital, for over 100 years. And it has sort of presented itself variously as a civil rights organization, as a Jewish organization, as an education organization, and as a Zionist organization. It just depends on its audience. And so it's important to sort of put the pieces together and understand what it's doing. The Anti-Defamation League's works, although the Anti-Defamation League presents itself as a civil rights organization, its work starts much earlier. It started in 1913, and it started around the same time as the other defense organizations. So what's left of those right now is the American Jewish Committee. And they also, like the federations, came out of a time when there was an existing Jewish elite, by which I don't mean people controlling the media at all. I mean that there were people who had a wave of immigrants who had already become wealthy and made good and were capitalists and looked at the new wave of Jewish immigrants coming into the US and were upset that they were leftists and they weren't quite white and they were rowdy, they were in the streets and they weren't respectable. It's a pretty classic way that old waves of immigrants view new waves of immigrants. They thought of them as disreputable. And so for various reasons, as Russian Jewish immigrants were organizing themselves as the left, the old guard of German Jewish immigrants, primarily German Jewish immigrants, organized themselves as the Anti-Defamation League and also the American Jewish Committee and another organization, primarily to suppress the Jewish left and to make sure that Jewish politics stayed aligned with the state. The reason that I bother to present this history is that fundamentally those politics are settler colonial politics. And it's fairly new that we understand the origins of state politics as settler colonial and that we understand that as important. But when you think about what are the core values of settler colonialism, the idea of industry and conquest of the land and the idea of European values, capitalism. These are all sort of interwoven in people's sense of what's worthwhile and what's good. And in fact, they're part of respectability politics. And so it's important to understand that the Anti-Defamation League embodies those politics from its inception. And so even when it moves into the post-war period where it starts doing, everybody is undertaking anti-fascism and opposing Nazism, and as it moves into the civil rights movement where the Anti-Defamation League becomes an important legal actor opposing things like housing discrimination and employment discrimination, it's doing so based on a core set of values that holds the US state and capitalism really central and important. And like many civil rights organizations, the Anti-Defamation League enters the civil rights movement as an anti-communist organization. In fact, its commitments to racial egalitarianism are partly about the importance of not allowing communists to own the space of pushing back on racial discrimination. So I'll just back up a little bit. So after World War II, the national embrace of egalitarianism positioned the Anti-Defamation League and actually also the American Jewish Committee as important resources for education on racial harmony, on egalitarianism, and there was a movement to try the community relations movement to try and build understanding between different ethnic communities. It was sort of in place of anti-racism. The idea was that racism, sort of the classic colorblind idea that racism was about bias and bad feeling and bad ideas. And so in order to combat it, people had to be taught not to think badly of people on the basis of their race or religion. That there was no sort of historical acknowledgement of what racism had done, or the fact that a store run by a white person and a store run by a Black person wouldn't be conceived of as having the same value. There is none of that sort of conception of structural racism. And so the Anti-Defamation League began to occupy the space of anti-racist education and anti-bias and community relations, and it sort of became an important agency in that regard. And so as it entered the civil rights movement as a very credible actor, and also representing Jews in the sense that that there was a sort of recognition of Jewish experience of racial hardship, and it entered the civil rights movement in kind of a complicated position, because on the one hand, it sort of traded on this idea that it was a reputable actor, an anti-racist educator, and as a Jewish organization, a sort of comrade in anti-racist struggle. And on the other hand, it was fundamentally a white organization. And so if you can imagine imagine in the moment now of the sort of push to do anti-racist education and anti-racist work in the era of Black Lives Matter, and politicians being like a little wary of it. Like if there is a white organization that comes along and is like, oh, you can listen to us, we'll tell you how to do anti-racism. And then all these, all the elected officials who are like, oh, that's great because Black people were making us really nervous. Let's go with the white organization. That's sort of the role that the Anti-Defamation League ended up being able to play, sort of filling in as a white organization, quasi-white organization, almost whatever version of it you'd like to call it, facilitating anti-racist work in a way that was less unnerving than actually having to deal with Black organizations. And so it really gained a foothold through its civil rights work, at the same time as being selective about what kind of work it supported. It persisted in respectability politics. The ADL was not particularly interested in the politics of protest. It was very interested in legal work. It had to kind of get dragged into the idea of sit-ins. It was always sort of on the conservative end of civil rights work. But because through its enormous, I don't want to diminish the legal work that the ADL did. It did led a lot of important legal work on housing discrimination and passing federal protections on employment and pushing back on legal discrimination. But it's the reputation that it developed out of civil rights work, as if it were sort of in struggle on the ground in the same way as everybody else, I think is a bit of a myth. And it's a myth that becomes important for the ADL now. I won't dwell on that too long, except to say that throughout that period, the ADL was also extraordinarily heavily involved in repressing the communist left, and particularly the Jewish communist left. As I'm sure you're all aware, Jewish communism was as vibrant a subculture as any in Jewish community. And it really, by the mid-50s, had been completely hammered into the ground, in part by the trial of the Rosenbergs, in which the ADL refused to acknowledge any anti-Semitism and cheered on the execution of the Rosenbergs. In fact, the judge who ordered the execution of the Rosenbergs was an ADL member and had been awarded by the ADL. And also the ADL and the other organizations with which it worked and the leadership of the Jewish community actually very deliberately and overtly made it so that Jewish community organizations, which were all funded from the communal pot, could not bring communist speakers or sympathizers to speak at community centers. Unions were purged of their communist members, et cetera. And so the capacity of Jewish communal organizations to include Jewish leftists was completely shut down. And the ADL was deeply involved in that. And so by the time we came out of the 50s and 60s, not only is the civil rights movement entirely anti-communist, but also the Jewish community has no space left in it for communists. And the reason this is important for it's not just historical, but I want to sort of get to the 70s and point to the sort of next piece of thing that happened, which is throughout that period, there's the process of Jewish whitening, for lack of a better term, was underway. So it took place in various ways. One way was that when people came back from World War II and began to move to the suburbs, the covenants on housing that kept Black people out of the suburbs and prevented Black people from using the GI Bill to get mortgages on their homes, those racial covenants for the first time included Jews as white, and so Jewish suburbanization proceeded apace. Organizations like the ADL had been able to crack the quotas on entry into universities. So Jewish students were able to enter universities and gain professional status. So Jewish whitening, by which it's shorthand, it's ugly, gross, weird shorthand for the idea of becoming included in political and economic life, was taking place throughout the 50s and 60s. And by the time Black nationalism and student movements had risen in the late 60s and 70s and started pointing out white privilege, Jewish communities were full-on white. And that created a problem for organizations whose stock in trade was civil rights organizing, and the idea that they were sort of allies in civil rights because they were racialized and had sympathy for that. It also created a problem because by that time, the Anti-Defamation League had become Zionist. It wasn't always Zionist, but it had become Zionist by that time. And part of the argument for Zionism was that Israel was a racial liberation project. So if Jews are not white, I mean, if Jews are white and they're not allied in the civil rights struggle because they're like Black, then their moral authority starts to be diminished. And then if their moral authority is diminished and Zionism rests on the moral authority of being a racially marginalized group, then Zionism becomes diminished. And so there was a bit of a crisis, of moral and racial crisis that was created by these processes all converging at once. And that crisis was exacerbated when Zionism also started to lose its credibility with the invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacre. That's exacerbated the crisis. In fact, many Zionist organizations by the early 80s had they'd stopped making the case for Israel as a moral case that, the United States should support Israel as a racial liberation project, and started instead describing it as a strategic ally of the United States.
Save the date, January 16th, an online forum of the Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization. The theme is Climate Change, Public Health Emergency. And to help dispel what may be a grim mood in late December, we play some images from a trip we took 5 years ago to Dykers Heights,